Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on strategies for monitoring and controlling costs and resources on AWS. Thank you all for joining us. I'm pleased to be here with you today, and I would like to introduce you to Will, who will be leading our session. Will has extensive experience on cost optimization, so we're looking forward to learning from his insights. Will, the floor is yours.
Amazing. Welcome, everyone. Let me share my screen and let's get started. Okay, in today's webinar, we will be exploring the different strategies that will help us to get a better understanding of the costs and a better control of our resources on AWS. The motivation for today's topic comes from different user stories where teams usually create a new cloud account to deploy a solution. They start launching resources and everything goes well until one day they get a pretty big bill. So they start asking, why are we getting such a high bill? And how can I reduce that? What are my options? And the reason for that is because we are traditionally more reactive with our costs on the cloud. We tend to worry when things already happen. The idea here is to be more proactive instead and try to get a better sense of the tools that can help us to have that billing under control. In this regard, we should prepare for awareness and visibility. It is important to understand those costs today and also how they change over time. On top of this, we should promote organizational mechanisms that can help us to transmit that information to the rest of our team or departments and maintain that cost efficiency and culture throughout the entire company. In terms of services on AWS that can help us with this purpose of visibility, we have a few options. The first one, I will say the most important one, is AWS Cost Explorer, which is a service where we get graphs and information on how our costs are distributed between different resources within our account. Then we have AWS budgets, which is also an important feature that will allow us to get alerted when things are going maybe above our expectations. And this is a fundamental action to do when we create a new account. Finally, we have AWS Billing Conductor, which is very useful for large organizations or when we have distributed teams or departments. So we can use that to put together the allocation of the billing and information among different accounts in a single place.
So can you elaborate a bit more on what's exactly the difference between these two services, the budgets and Cost Explorer, please?
Sounds good. Yeah, so AWS budgets, it's more of an alerting tool and a monitoring tool that is super straightforward to use. And we should probably use it when we create a new account so things don't run out of control, so we don't get unexpected charges into our account. While on the other hand, Billing Conductor is a much more advanced tool that you will need if you manage within your account multiple other AWS accounts or units, and you want to customize the experience of the invoicing, right? So you can create custom invoices. You can also work with chargebacks to balance the costs between your different organizations. So all in all, I will say always use budgets. And if you have the ability to manage multiple organizations, go for Billing Conductor.
Got it.
Okay. So if we move forward, once we get a better sense on how we did with the costs, we can take a step further and try to take action over more advanced techniques. A good way to compare these strategies is by thinking on the complexity of applying them versus the impact they could have in our costs. In a first stage, we have two options that we can highlight. One is called deletion of idle resources, which is a way to find those things that maybe are not really being used and see if we can destroy them. And then at the static data level, we also have intelligent tiering, which will allow us to optimize the storage of our objects in a way that can help us to save some money.
Sorry, going back to this intelligent tiering that you mentioned, are there any drawbacks or considerations that you should be aware of when you enable it?
Yeah, indeed, we will get indeed into this topic, but the idea is that we can make use of this feature when we have large objects. And the reason for this is because AWS monitors our objects to move them between buckets. So if we have very small objects of a few kilobytes, we will be probably paying more for the service compared to just leaving those out there in the frequent access tier, right? So you get the benefits when you actually use it with large objects that you want access for quite some time, right?
Great. And also for the audience, if you have any questions at any time, feel free to use the Q&A feature. You post your question there, and we will read it as soon as we see it. Thank you.
Amazing. So let's now do a deep dive into these two practices that we mentioned. So in regards to retiring unused resources, we found that it is usual to see EC2 and RDS resources and that are in an idle status. And this might happen because we created things for maybe testing purposes and we just forgot about them. So that is a very common use case. And along the same line, we could also have an attached volumes, IPs, and maybe load balancers. And even if we don't use them, we will be also paying for them. Finally, it is also very common to have old snapshots from different backups on services and sources, and they are also taking some space in our account. So for these scenarios, we can once again use Cost Explorer tool as a way to find where are we paying more than expected, maybe, and then we can go deep into that particular service and do a better assessment. Alternatively, we could use CloudWatch. Why not? As a way to find metrics that will help us to understand better our resources. This is somehow particularly useful when you have a large fleet of things and you are not really sure if you should delete a resource or not. So using CloudWatch will give you a sense of the usage of that particular resource. Now moving to the second practice for optimization of storage, AWS provides, as we were saying, something called S3 intelligent tiering that will monitor for us the access to the objects and will automatically move them into lower cost access tier. There are two main tiers that we can pick for, which are infrequent access and archive instant access, right? So we will be looking into an example of how can we use this particular feature. We are ready now to do our first stop on the presentation, and let's do a quick demo. We will be having two demos along the presentation, and in these first ones, we will be covering some of the things we've been seeing so far, right?
So okay, so while Will is loading his console, I just want to remind you all to use the Q&A feature here in the chat, so you can post any question. And also, if you have something that you would like to discuss with us, I shared in the chat. I can link so you can book any meeting for your convenience. Thank you.
Amazing. So once we are in the console on AWS, we can search for Cost Explorer in the search bar, which will take us to a service called Billing and Cost Management. And as soon as we get here, we can get an overview of our costs. First, we can see our monthly costs and also our forecast based on our historical data. And something important to remember around costs is that AWS calculates our costs every more or less 24 hours. So if it happened that you just created a new resource, you might see that reflected the day after, right? So have that into account. So we go now in the side panel to Cost Explorer. And here we can get a much better overview of our costs and how those are distributed between different services. So we can get a better idea on the reason for that total number, right? So in this example, we get EC2, VPC, and load balancing, etc., for a particular month. We can also change this chart and see a bar chart with the different increments over time. If we scroll down, we will have a breakdown through the different services and a much more detailed view in plain text on how those costs change over time. And if we keep scrolling, we will even see services that we are not paying for them, but they also will appear over here. Right? So hopefully this gives a first good look at how our costs are doing historically and today. And on the right side, we have a whole dashboard of filters that we can use to change this information. We have date range, so we can go to different time ranges. We also have the ability to change the granularity or also the grouping of this information. And we can apply filters by region, maybe tagging a particular resource or even platform. So we have many options on how we can display this information. If you look at this, you'll see that there's a particular charge that only occurs once a year. So let's exclude that to have a better look at the rest of the things. And now you get a better view of the rest of the services that you usually work with. And something else we were saying about Cost Explorer is that it is particularly useful when you want to identify those idle resources, or at least things that you think you shouldn't be paying that much for. So you could go to this chart and say, well, I'm paying too much for VPC this month. I'm just only using the default VPC. So this is a good starting point to just say, well, I'll go into VPC and look further into the reason for paying this amount, right?
Sorry, speaking about these unexpected increments, we have a question from the audience. Is it possible to configure alerts to be notified when certain unexpected increment in consume appears?
All right, yeah, that's actually a very good question. And we will be jumping into part of that question right away when looking into budgets. And you can also use a feature called cost anomaly detection, which will indeed help you discover those anomalies within your account, right? It is a particular service that works over your historical data, and you can configure, and it will work on behalf of you, and you will be alerted when you maybe, for example, you never use Redshift, but suddenly you get costs of $1,000 from one day to the other. You will probably receive an alert and an email. And I remember recently, for instance, using database migration service. And as it was the first time over a couple of years of using the same account, we got a notification asking if we were indeed using that service. So you might find this useful. And on the other hand, you could also use AWS budgets as a basic measure to tell you if you are indeed overspending during a certain month. So this is very easy to set up indeed. So let's do it. If you want to create a new budget, you can use either a template or a customized option. For the default templates, you get a very straightforward alternatives. The first one is zero spend budget, which you will use if you are working maybe with only the free tier limits. And in that case, you will be alerted as soon as you reach the first cent. Then I will say the most common one is using the monthly cost budget, where we can select a limit for the current month. So let's just leave that name and increase this to maybe 500. And it's easy as just adding an email over here. And you will be alerted with 3 different notifications. One, when you reach the 85% of this amount, a second alert when you actually reach that number, and even a third one that you will be receiving when your forecast spend reaches that number. So hopefully this gives you enough time for you to look into your costs and see if that makes sense, or you might need to take action, right? So let's go ahead and create this budget. And as you see, it's as easy as that. If we wait a few minutes, you will be seeing also a nice description like this, showing if you reach that number or if you are close to it, right? So this is about AWS budgets. Now, something else we also talked about was using CloudWatch. And CloudWatch will help us to somehow improve that research stage to understand our resources. It's very common to find teams with large set of resources, so they are not really sure if some server is being used or not, or maybe a database, or maybe a load balancer. So this is a good way also to work around that. So if we go to the metrics option on the side panel, and here let's do an example with EC2, you will be prompted with a list of different metrics for EC2. And if you keep scrolling, you'll find an option called CPU utilization, which kind of sounds like a good idea to measure if an instance is actually being used or not. We will be filtering this now for maybe the platform. And instantly you get a dashboard showing the CPU utilization for your different instances. Let's extend that a little bit to a week, maybe 6 hours. And yeah, here, as you can see, maybe these 2 instances have almost 0 CPU over time. So this doesn't mean that these instances are not being used, but at least those are good candidates to be kind of, deleted or maybe flagged or stopped to be removed, right? So yeah, a good way to also use Lambda CloudWatch with that purpose. Alternatively, we could use this same strategy for RDS, maybe looking into database connections, or perhaps load balancers and looking into inbound and outbound connections. So also a good way to use a service with that cost purpose. Finally, we also talked about using S3 and intelligent tiering. So let's do also a quick demo over here. We go to the buckets list, and let's pick one of these buckets. Imagine you have folders and files over here. And if you go to the properties section and scroll down, you will find an entry saying that we can enable intelligent tiering to do that automatic transition of objects. So let's do it. Let's give it a name. Then we can limit the scope of these to certain folders or files. or to all objects. I will just leave it to all objects. And we have the archive rule actions, where we specify how long are we willing to wait until that object transitions to the first tier. So the minimum is 90 days. And the same for the deep archive tier. And as you see, you get an alert saying that you need to be careful when using this, because in case you need to actually recover that object that went into some of these tiers, you will need to wait from 5 to 12 hours to recover that object. So make sure that works for your use case. Let's go ahead and create it. And this is already working for us. Regarding a question that Marcelo asked a few minutes ago, AWS charges a small fee for monitoring your objects, and you also pay a small fee when you transition objects between the different tiers. That's why working with very small objects or hot data doesn't make too much sense, right? So this, I think, much more useful and beneficial when working with large objects. So this intelligent tiering, you can also create your own lifecycle rules to customize even more that experience. And in that case, you will decide how objects transition between even more storage classes, right? So that's also something interesting to look into. So that covers our first stop. Let's head back to our presentation. And we are now ready to move forward to a set of more advanced concepts and techniques.
Just to be prepared for this, why are they more advanced? Are they very complex? So is this something that only has to be done by a super expert? Why are they advanced?
Yeah, not at all. I think I categorize this one because maybe they are a bit more conceptually harder to understand, but that doesn't mean that setting this up, it's hard. I don't think so at all. And hopefully you will see that during the demos, that is super easy to set these type of things up. So I will say the complexity goes more about understanding the concepts and trying to be careful, mainly with right sizing strategies and scheduling, and also preparing for your savings plans. So yeah, this is a way sort of to categorize the different strategies. So in a second level of optimization, I decided to put 3 other strategies. The first one called right sizing, where we change the current size or type of a certain resource to a more optimized or the smaller version. The second item is about scheduling the execution time of our dev, test, QA resources with the idea of saving computational hours mainly. And finally, we have what's called savings plans, which is also an important feature. And we will talk about this shortly. Okay, so right sizing, the first strategy, is the process of matching the size of a certain resource, like an instance or maybe a database, with the workload and performance that it actually needs, right? The idea is to optimize costs from that point of view. A good example is when we have, let's say, an instance or a database with an N4 large, which costs 80 cents per hour, but it may happen that we are not fully utilizing that potential. So if we identify that, we can maybe decrease to something like M4 large, pay much less per hour. And if the performance keeps in a healthy way, we can be saving certainly a lot of money monthly. Now, the second item here says to be careful if we are over provisioning for some reason. And a good example of this is when we create warm replicas or warm resources of our production solution. This is very common when we work with like resilient or fault-tolerant solutions, right? We have the production configuration and we have the exact same thing replicated. So in that case, your monitoring will show that second warm replica is not getting any traffic. Yeah, and in that case, that's perfect. That's okay for that scenario. But beyond cases like that, there's probably a potential for improvement. So what are the services that can help us with this particular strategy of right sizing? There are two main options on AWS. One of them is AWS Cost Optimizer, which is essentially a service that uses machine learning to analyze the metrics and resources and just do recommendations on size, on types, and things that we can learn from and apply them to our resources. Alternatively, we can use AWS Trust Advisor that integrates with some other different services and puts together recommendations, not only in terms of cost, but also in terms of security and performance. So it goes beyond that.
So how do you decide which one to use?
So how do you decide that? Well, let's say that Compute Optimizer is a dedicated service for what's cost optimization, right? It will look the way for you to use less computation and keep the same performance, and it only suggests about costs. On the other hand, Trust Advisor, I think, is a wider service, and it works with mainly Cost Explorer and metrics to get that sort of recommendations. But it covers more aspects like performance, stability, and also security recommendations. So I will say that it's not one or the other. You could perfectly use both services and get better assessments and maybe compare those suggestions. In terms of costs, Compute Optimizer has a small fee for working with your resources. And Trust Advisor, you need to pay for a basic business support plan in order to make it work in terms of costs. So have that also into account. Okay, so next we have scheduling of our dev and test or QA resources. So the idea of is that it is very common that we have maybe a development team which uses non-production resources during weekdays to try things out, to develop, and those are probably being used during a certain range within a day, so maybe office hours. So if we plan and schedule the events of turning off those instances or resources and turning them on maybe the day after or on Mondays, we can certainly save a lot of computational hours per month, because remember, you are charged usually for computation hours. So if we can identify those resources with maybe tags, I'm sure there's potential improvement to stop those instances during some hours a week. We will see how easy it is to set this up on AWS during the demo. Finally, we have what's called savings plans, which essentially is a commitment that we do with AWS in exchange for savings, right? So the idea here is to plan and try to understand the usage of our resources. That will help us to pick our best choice. So it's probably something you won't do as soon as you create your account, but once you get to understand your workload, it's something you can take a big benefit from. We can split these savings plans into 3 different categories. The first one is called reserve instances. And the idea is to reserve a capacity for a particular on-demand instance, family, and a type over the period of 1 or 3 years. So this type of plan was initially presented for EC2, but nowadays you can use this strategy for many other things like RDS, Redshift, Dynamo, OpenSearch. So there's a variety of things you can benefit this savings plans from. The second option is a bit more flexible. We commit to only a family and a region and not to a particular model. And what this means is that if in our previous example, reserved instances, we need to commit to, let's say, an EC2 T3 medium on Virginia, right? So it's super specific and we need to consume those credits of that instance. But in the second scenario, we only commit to T3 family and we can use that with either large, small, or nano, or as we want. So this is a better option and it's more flexible, but it only works with EC2 or Sage Medicare services, so more specific in that sense. Finally, we have compute savings, which is even a more flexible option, where we only commit to computational usage per hour, right? So we set a number of how much do we want to spend over 1 or 2 years, and we can use those credits with 3 different services, which are EC2, Fargate, or Lambda. So this is useful if maybe our resources are distributed between different type of systems, EC2, Fargate, Lambda solutions. We also get a big benefits if we have that set up, right? So also a good way to use savings plans. Yeah.
It sounds great because you're saving a lot of money, but it sounds like risky because you're committing to 1 or 3 years in the cases that you mentioned. So what do you have to consider in order not to get into a problem if you choose this option?
Yeah, right. Makes perfect sense. And actually, savings plans is actually about planning and designing your strategy over time. So that's why I wouldn't suggest to go directly for savings plans if you are just starting with AWS or maybe just creating your account. It is, I think, helpful when you've been using your account for a while, you know that you have your instance running for maybe more than a year, you have your database in place, and you are sure that the next year will be the same. So in that case, I will say yes, if you are sure that your system will be running more or less the same, commit to that number, you'll be saving a lot of money, and you can also pay at the end of the period. So I think for that particular scenario, it's super helpful. But it's also a good idea to understand the different options so you can get the most out of them. Right? All right, so we are now ready to do our second stop over here and do a demo of some of the things we've been discussing during this second part. Okay,
While
so
the console is loading, just wanted to remind you all to use the Q&A functionality in the chat. And also, if you have any question regarding your specific project that you would like to talk to us about that, I shared in the chat and a Calendly link so you can book a meeting. I will share it again in case you have just joined. So you can find it here in the chat. Thank you.
all right, so back to the console. We now head to Compute Optimizer to see an example of how we can use right sizing strategies. So as soon as you get to this service, you will be prompted with some savings opportunity information. Something important to remember that I mentioned is that the first time you enter here, you will be asked to enable Compute Optimizer. And the reason for that is because by default, this service is disabled because you will be paying a small fee. I don't remember the exact number now for using this service and let AWS to monitor your resources. But the interesting part happens on this side panel. These are the services that are supported nowadays by Compute Optimizer: EC2, Autoscaling, EBS, Lambda, RDS, ECS. So make sure you are using at least one of them to enable it. And if we enter, for example, to EC2, you will be prompted with a list of your instances for a current region. You can also filter them. And this large table will give you quite some good information about some optimizations you can apply over your instances. And there's a particularly interesting column, which is savings opportunity, that will show you if there's some room for improvement into your instance, even if that instance is optimized. So let's enter into the details of one of these. And you'll see this instance is actually optimized, but there's some room for improvement. Here, you'll be getting a list of recommendations for that instance. And in that case, if you see, this instance is using a T3 small family, and the recommendation is to use a T4G Graviton instance, which is newer, more efficient, and it costs less per hour. So this is a free recommendation you get, and you have some savings opportunity for your configuration. Now, something important to know is that Computer Optimizer only does recommendations. It does not apply the changes of these recommendations. In that case, we need to jump into the EC2 console and switch that instance ourselves. So just recommendations. Along the same line, we can maybe visit AWS to see another example. And here we can see that this particular volume has some good recommendations. And we can see in this option that if we migrate from GB2 to GB3, we will be also paying less per hour and getting probably the same level of performance with a performance risk very low. Again, we will need to go into EBS and switch those disks ourselves, right? So yeah, have a look into Computer Optimizer. Super helpful and super nice service to visit. Then we also talked about using scheduling of resources and how that can help us to have better control of the running hours of our resources. And typically, you will probably set up your configuration using maybe an event-rich cron that runs over non-office hours, and a Lambda function that sends command to your instances to turn them off, and again to turn them on. But nowadays, there's a particular quick, easy way that might be helpful for your use cases, and it's by using AWS Systems Manager. If we go to the quick setup on this service, there's a library tab that we need to click on. And here you will be presented with a list of different quick configurations that work on top of CloudFormation that can help you resolve some particular things. One of them is the scheduling of our resources. If we type in for schedule, this particular configuration will appear saying that it will help us to schedule our instances to stop and start at the time we specify. So exactly what we want. Let's go ahead and create. The first thing you need to do is to match this configuration with your instances through tags. So let's imagine that we tagged all of our instances for demo and QA and test with something called maybe resource availability. And we give it a value of weekends off. Next, we specify when we want to schedule this configuration. Let's follow the example and click on the weekends only. Hopefully this works today. There we go. Then we select the target instances, custom or on our current account, current region. We get an overview of the roles needed for this. Next, we just give this a name. And we get a summary saying how this scheduler will run. We will be tagging resources with this value, and it will be running during these time ranges. So we are ready to just go ahead and create this configuration. And as easy as that, you wait a few minutes and you will be having a nice dashboard showing how many instances match this configuration, when this schedule ran, and you also get some analytics. So a good way to have control over your instances, right? So lastly, we talked about savings plans. So let's go back into the cost management console. Okay, if we scroll down over here, you'll see under savings and commitments, two options called savings plans and reservations that will cover those ideas that we mentioned earlier. The first one, which is just called reservations, shows this commitment to a specific instances and types. And in this case, we have a list of services, which include EC2, RDS, Elastic Cache, Redshift, OpenSearch, MemoriDB, and DynamoDB. Next, we need to select the term of the commitment of 1 or 2 years, the class, and some other options, also how we will be paying for this. And we get some recommendations on how we can use this strategy. As you can see, there are 2 instances that we could reuse, and these recommendations come from historical data. These instances have been running for a while, so AWS is saying, why don't you commit to 1 year of using it, and you will be saving quite some money. This changes if you decide to maybe pay partially or all at the end. And in case you want to proceed, you will be taken to the EC2 console. Once in the EC2 console, you can go to reserve instances, and here you need to select the exact type of the instance. This, you get search and you get one or many results. So here is where you proceed with this commitment, right? So the same way we could do the same for RDS. We will need to go into the RDS console and so on, right? So that's the first type of reservation plan you can use. Make use of the recommendations. They are actually justified. And then over the savings plan option, we will have the other type of strategy. We go right here to buy the saving plan, and we have 3 different options. The first one is computed savings, which works for EC2, Fargate, or Lambda. And this is very easy to set up, actually. You commit to the same options, 1 or 2 years, and you just need to enter the hourly commitment. And you can use this spend with any of these 3 options, EC2, Fargate, or Lambda, and you decide how to pay, right? So you get an overview of how much you need to pay to cover the whole year by spending this amount hourly. You may want to use the AWS calculator to get a sense of how much every service counts. But yeah, this should give you an idea of that. Then we have EC2 in savings plans, which is pretty similar, but as we mentioned earlier, we just commit to a particular region and just a family, just like T3 or something like that, and not to T3 medium, small, or large. And then it's the same idea to select the hourly commitment. Finally, we can also do the same for SageMaker in case we're working with this particular service. So hopefully this gives you an idea of the different options to work with savings plans, play around, try to see if that fits your use case. Right, so let's go back to our presentation. Hopefully that gave you an idea of some additional strategies, but we could go even further in some other ways. On the left side, if you see, I added what's called enterprise programs, which are more about having a commitment of a monthly spend with AWS. This is usually for large companies, probably spending more than $100,000 monthly. So if that's your case, you will certainly be treated very well, and you will have a personalized program where you can certainly get some good benefits. On the right side, we have two more options that are somehow more advanced. One is right-sizing our production configuration. So similarly to what we did for development and configuration, we can do the same for production, which usually is a more expensive set of things. But have in mind this will certainly incur into operational risk. Changing production might get to unexpected results when you get maybe traffic peaks at some hours. So you need to make sure your performance stays accurate. Then we can work with architecture refactoring, which is this option. And this is useful when we maybe, I've seen this when teams move to a serverless solution. So they only pay for on-demand usage, right? So they pay for a large instance, but maybe that use is just good for a few hours, and overnight is not really being used for. So on serverless services might also be a good idea. Alternatively, we have spot instances, which are kind of dynamic resourcing, and can be helpful for things like batch jobs and offline processes. So yeah, have in mind that these architecture strategies require you to change probably things and play with your resources. That's why they are on the most complex side of things. So these cover more advanced techniques. And as a quick recap of this presentation, we have discussed across this webinar different optimization strategies. We had a look at the billing console. We went through different strategies such as right sizing, scheduling, savings plan, also using CloudWatch and S3. And finally, we mentioned some more advanced refactoring techniques. Hopefully, this gets you to a more aware and efficient position in regards to cloud management. And that's it for today. I know, Marcel, if we have any questions in the chat.
Yeah, we have some questions from the audience. One is this applicable to companies of all sizes? Is this right for a startup? Are there any limitations to things that they cannot do? You mentioned something about some enterprise programs that are for a certain amount of billing, but I guess all of your techniques, or the techniques you mentioned, all apply in scale to a startup, right?
Absolutely, yes. As soon as you create your account, I recommend you to go and set your budgets, and also try to be on top of that Cost Explorer service, where you can play around and understand your costs, which are not easy to understand from AWS, mainly because they work hourly. And yeah, Cost Explorer will certainly be a good starting point. And then if you want, try to move forward as soon as you keep growing and creating things, to play around about maybe scheduling and right sizing. Those are also good ways to move forward.
Yes, thank you for that. And I have another question also regarding different cloud providers, specifically between AWS and Google Cloud. If someone has to start, they have a project, why choosing AWS?
Well, if that question goes around costs, you might need to compare using the AWS calculator. before taking action, I would say. Where you create estimates, those are not super exact, that's why they are estimates. For here, you can get certain granularity of the configuration. So here you can select like, well, in my Google account, I'm having 3 servers, how much they cost on AWS. I have a load balancer on Google Cloud, how much that costs on AWS, and move forward with that and maybe create your ballpark estimate. And it will give you a sense of cost comparison between those services before even creating an account on AWS. This is a free page. So it might be a first good approach into a cost reason to move into AWS. That's an answer in terms of costs, reasons in technical terms of why it's better one cloud than the other. You might need to find reasons that are not letting you to be comfortable with the Google account. So if you find that there are missing services or maybe missing features, then you might need to look into AWS if there's a service that covers that particular need. Otherwise, migrating from cloud to cloud is a very large effort, so nothing easy to do. So I will make sure to plan ahead and make sure it makes sense to transition from one cloud to the other.
Great. Okay, we have covered a lot. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Will, for all that you shared. We hope you found the information helpful for managing the AWS costs. So if you have any questions or need assistance, just go on the link that I shared. We can chat and we can discuss your specific situation. We're here to help. So hope to see you soon. Have a great day.